Hello, everybody. We are back again. And this is the topic that we will talk about today. Is something that we have kind of mentioned in the past episodes as well. And I feel like it would be good if we just got to explaining what are parts, what is parts work. And maybe we can just jump into first, maybe you can define or explain what are the parts so we can understand what is it that we're talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. So nice to be with everybody again on the Magnetic Masculinity Podcast, where we help men step into their evolutionary excellence and heal out of the emotional dark ages. And part of that model is we're helping support men in stepping into their magnetic masculinity, is looking at the concept of the multidimensional man or parts work, or in psychology, this is called internal family systems, IFS. Parts work. I'm calling it the multidimensional man. And this is the concept. We could almost relate it to being similar to that we all have multiple personality. So that used to be like a scary disorder that we would think about. But I would invite us to consider that we all have multiple personalities. And think about a time in your life when you had to make a decision and part of you was excited about it, but part of you was afraid of it. And part of you thought it was a good idea. And part of you thought it was a terrible idea. So it's really looking at these multidimensional aspects of ourself. And when we're on that journey, piloting our vehicle of consciousness to authentic alignment, which we talk about, I believe, in episode 2, is figuring out which parts of us are authentic, which parts of us are coping mechanisms, which parts of us are protector personalities, and which parts of our authentic self are banished to the subconscious and don't have what I call a seat at the table of your consciousness. So I'd like you to imagine yourself as a CEO of yourself. So all the men listening, imagine that you are the CEO of all of these parts of yourself. And we want to sit them all around a circular table or a boardroom table. And we want to give them a seat at that table. And we want to give them a chance to hold the talking stick so that we can understand what their authentic wants, needs, boundaries, and values are. And the reason this is important is because often in childhood, we deny, disown, reject, or disidentify from our authentic personality parts in order to fit in. We've talked about that in a previous episode, the confusion of fitting in with love and belonging because we're in the emotional dark ages. So, for instance, if you were a man growing up in this era and you came home from school one day and you started crying and you heard feedback like, don't be a crybaby, man up, go to your room until you're done, don't cry, don't be angry, whatever it is, or you like to wear a flamboyant red shirt and your mom says to you one day, oh, that looks ridiculous, you're not wearing that to school, go take it off. Whatever it is in childhood, we decide what parts of us, which aspects of our personality bring us closer to those that we need in childhood and those which we perceive as being rejected. And we sort through all these aspects of our personality and come up with our self-concept, which sometimes happens to coincide with our authentic alignment, but more often than not, it does not. So it's almost like we want to start questioning who we think we are. So again, we can start to explore which parts of us are protector personalities. So what I mean by that is if you have a really vulnerable, scared part, like think of it like the inner child, it's often called. So your inner child would be one of your parts. And that inner child is vulnerable and scared and wants somebody to hold him and tell him everything's going to be okay. But that's too weak for a man, or that is too whatever he thinks it is for a man. He will develop a protector personality that steps in front of that part and says, hey, I don't need anybody. Or they might become defensive. And if these parts, if we're not aware of them and we don't give them a seat at the table of our consciousness, and they're in the subconscious, what happens is they do a hostile takeover of the talking stick and facilitate some of our less evolved, more ridiculous behaviors. The other aspect to look at is another way to look at it is we have parts of ourselves we identify with and parts of ourselves we don't identify with. This is where blind spots, as we common call it in corporate coaching. This is where our blind spots come in. The parts of us that don't fit our self-concept, that have not been given a seat at the table, that are acting from the subconscious. It's more helpful to look at those parts. This is often referred to as shadow work, or looking at those quote unquote toxic traits, but I don't love that terminology. So looking at those parts, giving them a seat at the table of our consciousness, and finding out what their positive intentions are. You remember in the first or second episode, we talked about love and belonging being the number one biological, neurological, scientifically inarguable need of the human species. And in childhood, we confuse fitting in with love and belonging. Loneliness is the absence of that. That is why it is the most painful, excruciating condition on the planet. But here's what I realized at one point in my journey when I was dealing with depression and burnout, and didn't matter what I achieved, how many relationships I had, I still felt lonely, stuck, and like something was missing and I didn't know what it was. And it occurred to me at one point when I was in a sort of a silent state, when I was recovering from a head injury. So I had like a couple of months of a meditative silent state where I had a lot of these realizations that what I was missing was these unintegrated parts of my authentic personality. So that love and belonging that we seek needs to begin within those parts of ourselves. So let's use a part like an inner critic. That's a part that a lot of people can identify with. So we have an inner critic. And instead of looking at our inner critic and saying, oh, that inner critic is terrible, I need to get rid of it, or I hate that part of myself, we can look at that inner critic and sort of give it a seat at the table, let it hold the talking stick, and figure out what is the positive intention of that inner critic? And how do I, as the CEO, mentor that inner critic into a more helpful aspect of my personality? We can promote it. Something I help people do is promote the inner critic to an inner coach. So we're not judging, shaming, or further disassociating from those parts of ourselves, the parts that we might judge or we might not think are worthy, because again, that increases the separation. Rather than giving them a seat at the table, letting them hold the talking stick, and finding out what their authentic wants, needs, boundaries, and values are. Now, let me give you an example of how this plays out in the real world. So myself in childhood, I grew up with a lot of what we might refer to as feminism. So I got a lot of praise for being strong and independent. And I watched how my mom could do it all. And there was a lot of propaganda around like, you don't need a man, women can do everything. So the authentic parts of me that were like really feminine and really like wanted to be cherished and adored by a man and wanted to co-create with a man and feel safe and feel protected and soft, I condemned those parts of me to the subconscious. And I identified as a tough woman. And if I saw women outside of myself who were very like embracing the feminine and like, I love my man and I need my man, I would be like, oh, brutal. She is so weak. That is not like me at all. So I had denied, disowned, rejected the authentic part of me, and I was judging and shaming her in my external reality. So I would never have felt fulfilled unless I looked at, hey, now for me, this is just my authenticity. Everybody is different. For me, I actually do have an aspect of my personality. My CEO, Sandy, she is a boss. She likes to get stuff done. She loves to work. She loves independence. And there's another character at the table of my consciousness who loves being adored and pampered and cherished and admired and appreciated and contained and protected by a man. But I would have been ashamed to look at that part of myself. So by giving her a seat at the table of my consciousness, I, as the CEO, can decide when each part of me should be holding the talking stick. So let's use this as an example for men. If men have a really sensitive side that they let out when they're hanging out with their toddlers or holding their baby for the first time. Now that I work with a lot of high performers, that might not be the best part to be holding the talking stick when they're making $100 million business deal. But allowing that aspect to be there will increase their compassion and have this sort of balance and knowing, when to be the father, when to be the husband, when to be this, when to be that, but looking at those authentic parts of the personality and challenging the parts of ourselves, challenging our self-concept a bit and seeing, is who I think I am actually in alignment with what lights me up and makes me feel good? Let me use another example. I lived in an area previously, which there's nothing wrong with, I'm just using an example, that was very into hunting and ranching and quadding. It was very masculine, cowboy sort of culture, very cool, nothing wrong with it. Now, if you were a very sensitive boy who liked classical music, reading, philosophy, and poetry, and you grew up in that family and you always had your head in a book, and you heard something from your family like, why do you always have a head in your book? Get out there, son, and let's go quadding. Or do you want to sit around with the girls, or do you want to go fishing with the men, or whatever it is? They could have suppressed those authentically aligned parts of themselves, condemned them to the subconscious in order to fit in, because again, we confuse fitting in with love and belonging, therefore increasing the loneliness and separation from our authenticity. So it didn't matter if you became the best cowboy, the most successful rancher with $85 million and a wife and kids and hundreds of acres of land, and you went quadding every weekend and you owned, whatever. If that wasn't who you actually were aligned to be, and you didn't allow those parts of you to at least sometimes hold the talking stick and get their needs met and be witnessed and seen and presenced, and in fact, you judged those parts in other people, well, that's weak, or how, and you started judging that, and then you're actually shaming parts of your authentic self, which is basically what caused them to separate in the first place, which causes this sort of continuous existential loneliness, longing, feeling like something is missing, but you don't know what it is. Often it's these unintegrated parts. And the challenge is, if we're not aware of them, your needs must be met. And most of us, a lot of us in society, I can't speak for everybody, feel ashamed of, through societal programming, feel ashamed of what some of our authentic wants, needs, boundaries, and values are. Or many men have never been taught that it's okay to have boundaries, and they're taught that they're selfish or greedy for wanting what they want. So again, if these parts in the subconscious aren't getting their needs met, they will manipulate to get their needs met. And again, they will do that hostile takeover from the subconscious and facilitate some of our more either self-abusive or externally unpleasant or more ridiculous. I don't like to fear those parts of ourselves. I kind of laugh at them. I think of them like little children. They're worthy of love, but they could use a little mentorship, and we don't really want them in charge of things necessarily. But again, if we don't give them a seat, they will do that hostile takeover from the subconscious and facilitate some of our less evolved behaviors. Or it can also, so it could work a different way. It could work like, let's use a young boy as an example who's lived in a family who praised excellence. Be number one. You have to get straight A's. You have to be captain of the football team. You have to get into a good school. Be the best. You're a winner, son. You can win. Any part of him that is not a winner will be judged and shamed and suppressed to the subconscious. And he will create a self-concept of perfectionism and being the best. And that might be in a healthy way, or it might be in sort of a a more of a narcissistic flavor way, which is just a shame disorder. I don't judge it. It's just a way to manipulate to get our needs met. So they would identify as that. Now, if you grew up in a household that was like, this was more how I felt growing up. I was incredibly smart. I was intellectually gifted, but I got bullied by my peers for being a smarty pants. And I got called a show off and a know-it-all. And don't brag. Don't think you're better than anybody. And women in society are programmed to don't think you're better. Be humble. Don't speak up. Be invisible kind of thing. Don't outshine. So for me, instead of trying to be the best at everything and grow perfectionism, like the first example, I was more like dulling my light. So the first person would have more blind spots about the ways that they're not good enough, and they would project that onto external people outside of them. Whereas I would more project my awesome onto others, and I would look at people that were intelligent and I would yearn or fall in love with or adore them. So you can either project your shadow or project your awesome. And what we judge in others and what we worship in others can be very helpful clues to our authentic alignment when we're in this process of understanding our parts and finding our authentic wants, needs, boundaries, and values, not the wants, needs, boundaries, and values of our self-concept. Because again, if we use some of the examples or stories of the cowboy, if you ask him, what are your wants, needs, boundaries, and values? He'd be like, well, I value whatever he would say he valued. And
Being
my
tough.
wants, yes, would be very different than what his authentic wants, needs, boundaries, and values are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like few things that I maybe wanted to touch on with this is, one would be identifying them. Then how do we actually give them that seat at the table? How does that look like? And then with the coaching them, those are kind of the steps, or kind of what I heard there. So even like with identifying them, how do we, or like let's say with examples that you gave, how can these men identify what are their parts, or how they show up, how they can even like kind of notice them?
Well, like we talked about in our last episode, awareness is the first step. And we always celebrate the awareness because a lot of these parts we have, again, compartmentalized in childhood and disidentified from out of shame or trying to fit in. So if we really celebrate the awareness, we can reprogram our brain to welcome self-awareness or blind spot opportunities. And that's going to mean owning some of our awesome that we have not been willing to step into and own and embody. And it's also going to mean owning our shit, or I call it in my coaching, eating some shit sandwiches. But we celebrate those too, because again, we're always ever expanding awareness. So the curiosity and compassion and intention, and even understanding this model, you're already on the way, because at least you can start to question things. Do I really love this? I go horseback riding every week because my mother loved horseback riding and that's how we felt close. Do I actually love it? And just sort of questioning yourself and just asking, does this make me feel great or does it not make me feel great? So again, awareness is the key. A lot of men will have some awareness of what some of the parts are. Like I have workbooks that help people work through some of these things. So some of the things in that workbook would be, what were you praised for in childhood? And what were you shamed, judged, or punished for in childhood? And that, that can sort of give you some curiosity of like, oh, maybe I didn't rejected any part of me that wasn't good enough. And I don't give myself permission to be anything but perfect. Maybe it's being curious and trying new hobbies and just being like, who knows, maybe I'll try this, maybe I'll try 10 things I've never tried with no expectation and just see if something sparks this thing in me or does not. What did I love as a child? What activities did I love as a child? There's lots of ways, but being curious, sort of dating yourself, I guess, being curious about yourself. And then again, it's important if we become aware of any parts of ourselves, not to judge, suppress, shame, or blame them. Again, we can acknowledge, we want to accept them, because otherwise what happens commonly is that we perpetuate the behavior that caused those parts of us to compartmentalize or disassociate in childhood in the first place. We take it over as an adult and we're like, oh, this characteristic is weak, or I can't stand people that talk too much. And maybe we got judged for being too sensitive or talking too much or too this or too that in childhood. So then we swing the pendulum the opposite way. And we're like, oh, I'm a very quiet person. I don't like to speak out. I like to be in the shadow. Maybe that is true. For some people, that is authentic. But maybe you're actually somebody who's like, I want to be seen. I want to be heard. I have something to share. I am excited and energized. But your coping mechanism in childhood, your protector personality behind that vulnerable, authentic part, coped by becoming very quiet and very unobtrusive and not making waves, So it's this curiosity, but never judging those parts of us. Now, when we accept them, part of acceptance is accepting that some things need changing. So if we look at a part of ourselves, we're like, oh, I work with a lot of high-performing men and couples. And sometimes it looks like, hey, you're kind of a bully. And not judging that, being like, shame collapsing, I'm a bully, I'm a terrible person. No, it's, oh, let me be curious about my inner bully. What needs is he meeting for me? Let me give him a seat at the table of my consciousness, and let me, as the CEO or the wise adult or leader, mentor him into his potential that is there. He just hasn't been given the tools to meet his needs in an effective way. Or the inner child. How are we nurturing the inner child? That little boy in us, well, not in me, but maybe I do. I don't know. That little boy in the men I work with who want to, I don't know, just be held sometimes and told everything's okay. You're going to be here. A lot of men just want to be held sometimes, but it would be very embarrassing for them to ask for that, because they would have disidentified from that part in order to be a man, be strong, be tough, be a provider, be a father, be a husband, be all this. But who's asking them, what do you want? So, and another way we can find out about our blind spots is asking. Now, we have to be very mindful of who we ask, because remember, everybody perceives us differently through their own unintegrated parts, which end up being distortions and projections. And so you want somebody who has some integration or clarity, which is where a coach can be very helpful, or also because I just know what common patterns are. I know what protector personalities are. And I know from a little bit of information that I have men fill out in a workbook, I have at least a fairly reasonable hypothesis of the fastest way to help them on that journey of authentic alignment and integration. Because again, if we don't know what our authentic wants, needs, boundaries, and values are, and we don't know who actually should be having a seat at the table of our consciousness, how can we possibly, A, expect somebody else in a relationship to meet needs that we don't even know we have? And B, how can we assess the different areas of our life in career, social life, finance, family life, relationships, friendships, leisure activities, travel, whatever? How can we possibly assess if those things are what are going to fulfill us or not, if we're not even sure who we are and we're not willing or feel like we're worthy of asking for what we really want and finding a healthy way to get that need met? Because again, if we're not meeting our needs in a healthy way, we're either going to shut down and become exhausted and tired. That's the same thing. Exhausted, burnt out, unfulfilled, stuck, stagnant, shut down, withdrawing, or we're going to lash out and project it and blame and bully and judge and critique and blame and shame and whatever. So I think that self-awareness and integration, it should be one of the primary goals of the human species.
So going from there, maybe even some men listening that might identify some of the parts just from the examples. So how can they bring it to table of awareness. How does it look like? How do you give them those parts a voice, or how do you listen to them or make them feel heard? Like what's the process there?
You could, so first of all, the awareness, if they're in your awareness, they have a seat,
Okay.
right? Because anything that's not in, doesn't have a seat is in the subconscious. Or we're aware of it, but we're like, ew, this guy's a loser. So it's either we're not aware of them, or we're like, I'm not like that. Like I can think of things that I would have been like, I'm not an angry person, because in my childhood, anger was disapproved of, or I disapproved. So any part of me that was ever angry, or in society, it's like, don't be, women are this or that if they're angry, So I'd be like, I'm not an angry person. So even if I was angry, I wouldn't even be able to recognize my own anger, because it just didn't fit my self-concept. And your brain will only find evidence of what it believes, which means you're going to go around either suppressing that anger and making yourself sick, or you're going to leak it out on others or leak it out on yourself and not be self-aware of it. So again, we celebrate the awareness. But even then, if I'm like, okay, I do have a part of me that has anger, but I judge anger, or I'm afraid of anger, or socially other people can't hold space for anger. So this part of me, okay, oh God, I'm aware there's an angry part. Ew, gross. Okay, I need to get rid of her. So she's either in the subconscious, or I'm judging her and going, ew, God, oh no, bad. She's wrong. And I'm not providing love and belonging. So I'm getting further and further away from that part of me, increasing the separation, rather than giving her a seat and going, okay, what is this anger here to teach me? Let me thank her, thank this part of me, thank the angry part, thank the inner critic, thank the inner bully, thank whatever they are. Give them that seat, presence them. You could do, there's therapists that focus on internal family systems. There's coaches that do parts work coaching, like myself. So it's a process you can learn through books, through help with others. But really, the most important part is celebrating the awareness and approaching that part of us with compassion and curiosity, and trying to figure out what their underlying positive intention is, or what need they are meeting for you, or what authentic part of you they might be protecting.
So
right.
Then moving into, let's say now they have the seat at the table.
Mm-hmm.
How can men go about coaching that part?
Well, a lot of men I work with are high performers, entrepreneurs. So they have some leadership skills, or they might be fathers. So they have some compassion skills. So I lean into the skills they have, and we say, what does it feel like when you want to help an employee that you really love and trust and see a lot of potential in? How do you mentor them? You look at what's not working. You find out what their skills and gifts are, even if they're a little bit hidden. And then you encourage them to lean into those gifts, and you coach them when they make mistakes, but you do so with love and acceptance. Or how do you approach your child if your child is 4 years old or 2 years old and they're trying to climb up a flight of stairs and they fall down, or they go to kindergarten and they punch some other kid in the face and eat glue and pee on the floor or something? How do you deal with that inner child? You don't go, you are bad. Or if we do, then that's another shit sandwich we need to eat, because we're projecting unhelpful strategies on, which we all do. So again, either we're going to boss up and own it and be aware of it and integrate it and adopt and mentor it, or we're going to be blind to it to protect our self-concept. That's one of the dangers of I don't like the word danger. That's one of the sneaky parts of a self-concept. So sometimes I work with, let's say, a high-performing CEO who has children. Now, if his self-concept is based on, I am a good father and I am a boss, I'm a CEO and I run a good company, if that's what his self-approval is based on, that's the self-concept, then he might, so in the healthy way, it would look like, hey, I really want to be a good father and I really want to be the best CEO I can. So therefore, could people please make me aware of ways that I'm not showing up in my authentic alignment? hey, in what ways am I kind of being a jerk to my kids? Or in what ways am I blind to how my employees feel about me? What are my blind spots? And you're actively seeking it out because you genuinely, from the core of your being, want to be those things. Now, in the less helpful coping mechanism, subconscious part, you have to be a good father and you have to be a good CEO in order to be worthy of your own approval, because there is nothing acceptable but excellence. And any part of you that does not fit that gets banished to the subconscious, where they start to get resistant and manipulative and upset and frustrated. But you don't want to hear, how dare you tell me I'm not a good father? I am a good CEO. Well, then you're probably, if you're getting super triggered and activated and upset, then it probably means that you're protecting a self-concept rather than authentically wanting to be that.
A question would be about, and you mentioned this in some of the previous episodes, about some men thinking that they need, let's say, if we choose that one part, inner critic, for them to succeed.
Yeah.
How can they coach, let's say, this part if they find it necessary or needed, or kind of like something that is really important to have?
Yes, that's wonderful. So let's use the inner critic. So that part of you might be, let's look at the inner critic, okay? And I used to have a brutal inner critic, like really abusive. Like I would probably go to jail if I spoke to anybody else the way that my inner critic spoke to me. So let's look at first, we become aware of that inner critic. And a lot of high performers tell me, I wouldn't get out of bed. I wouldn't be the CEO I am today. I wouldn't own 5 companies. I wouldn't have 2 PhDs if I didn't have this inner critic driving me and pushing me. Totally valid. I can understand that. And I've been there. So what I would invite them to say for that inner critic is, we're going to acknowledge the value of the inner critic, but we're going to promote it to an inner coach, because its authentic need is to perform, or to, it could be an authentic need, or it could be a coping mechanism, but we won't get that into it. But basically, the outcome that we love about that inner critic is achieving things. So let's give that inner critic a seat at the table of our consciousness. Let's thank it, but let's also identify that it can be very abusive, right? So if we wouldn't speak that way to a puppy or our child or our wife or our baby brother or whatever, or yourself as a 7-year-old, don't speak to yourself that way. But again, we don't want to judge or disidentify or create more separation with the inner critic. We want to give them a seat and we want to say, hey, buddy, thanks. Like, thank you. Because what are the positive intentions of an inner critic? It is partially, it can be, these are different things. So these are looking at the inner critic. The inner critic's positive intention is to prevent you from making mistakes so that you are worthy of acceptance. Because in whatever part of childhood you decided that in order to be worthy of love and belonging, and how you would fit in was by never making a mistake. So then the inner critic decided, well, I'm going to drive you into growth. I'm going to drive you into achieving things. I'm going to push you and force you and bully you. It might be that that's how your father or coach or teacher spoke to you in childhood. It could be that too. But we can identify that it has some positive outcomes, but that it needs a little bit of mentoring. So then we promote it to an inner coach. And I would invite men, and I do this all the time. Now, we have 2 children. One child, we want them to get a good grade so that they get into a good school. One child, we're going to say, come on, you're such a loser. You've got to do better than this. You're smarter than this. Come on, you've got to get straight A's. Get up early. Do this. God, you're such a dumbass. Why are you doing that? I can't believe you went and played soccer instead of studying. You should never be doing that. You've always got to do this. Get up. What an ass. You better hope nobody realizes what a loser you really are. That kid might get straight A's. So it does work. But which would be more fun, that or somebody saying, hey, you know what? I think you are so smart. You're going to fail sometimes, and that's okay. But I know that you're going to get good grades. How can I support you in that? I'm so proud of you. You've got this. Sometimes you're going to do great and sometimes you're not going to do the best, but you're going to celebrate those people who win, whether it's you or somebody else. You know, you're winning just by, well, we don't necessarily want to do the you're winning just by showing up. We do want to have some accountability. Both. There's a balance or a fine line there somewhere, I think. And hey, when you achieve this or that, what do you want more than anything? You want a new set of golf clubs. You want to go sailing around the world with your wife. You want to manifest your ultimate goddess queen to call into your life. Well, great. First, we're going to do these really hard things and we're going to reward ourselves and we're going to cheer ourselves on every step of the way. So you see the difference. You're still going to get stuff done. One of them, there's no denying that that does get things done. Now, another positive intention of an inner critic that a lot of people may not have awareness of is that it protects the vulnerable part of us from external criticism. Because somehow in our psyche, we feel that like it'll be easier to hear it from me than it will from mom, dad, coach, brother, buddies, you know, society as a whole, my boss, my employees, whatever. So the inner critic's like, hey, I'm going to keep you in line. I'm going to make sure you don't make any mistakes. And I'm going to call you out on everything so that you never have to hear that from somebody else. So again, it's looking at that part of us with compassion, giving it a seat, and then saying, hey, thank you. Thank you for doing your best. I'm not going to, we don't want that part of ourselves to think it's dying or that it's being rejected or judged. We want to bring it in, give it that seat, and then mentor it. Hey, buddy, I'm going to give you a promotion. You're going to be my inner coach. And guess what? You're going to fail a bunch of times. You're going to go back to the inner critic, and that's okay. And then you as the CEO, every time you notice that you've gone from the inner coach back to the inner critic, you're going to celebrate the awareness and cheer that guy back on and say, you got this. It's okay. What are 3 positive things I could find out of this? Or how can I encourage myself to do better today? Not from a place of I'm not good enough, but from a place of I am excellent. So what can I do a little bit better today? And if I did my best yesterday and it wasn't great, well, I did my best. And what did I learn from it?
And what can men do with parts that they know that are there, but they either there's like shame about them, or it's like they're perceived as weak or not manly, and they might not even want to bring them or give them a seat? Like what happens with those parts?
That is really common. And again, you named the word perfectly, which is shame. So again, let's look at our little spectrum. Love and belonging, number 1, biological or neurological, scientifically arguable need of the human species. Absence of that, loneliness. Confusing fitting in with love and belonging. The barrier to love and belonging is shame. So it's very normal. We don't have to shame our shame. It's very normal to have shame. We grew up in the emotional dark ages. So all of these authentic parts that most men have in common, they all think they're the only ones. I will sometimes have 3 men a day telling me, I have a secret, a confession, because they trust me, because they know that I never judge them and I really receive all of their parts. And they'll tell me things and I'm like, yawn, and they're like, what are you doing? What are you talking about? I'm like, yeah, that's perfect. You're not alone in that. Most men feel that way. They just haven't been raised to be open about that. And we are all in this together. Women raised men, we're all in this together. There's no judging it or shaming it. They didn't raise themselves. We were in a culture that emotionally crippled men. But yes, it's very normal to feel afraid of going in there, or a lot of men are like, if I go to the deep, vulnerable, emotional places, I won't be able to get things done. Or what if I just turn into this like crying pile of soppy mess for the next 5 years? Or what if, and because the brain prioritizes what is familiar and tries to avoid discomfort, and men aren't taught how to process emotions. Yeah, that's very normal that they feel that way. But I would invite them to consider that I've talked to Mensa members, I've worked with Mensa members, leaders, thought leaders, game changers, PhDs, CEOs, entrepreneurs, millionaires, you name it. And something that they all have in common is that they have this, like a bit of imposter syndrome, feeling like they're missing out, feeling like they don't have somewhere to talk about their problems, feeling like they have to be strong for everybody else, feeling like they have to suppress their emotions. So instead of that isolation that shame requires, I instantly create an inhospitable environment for shame by celebrating the awareness and allowing the shame to be there. We don't want to judge the shameful part of us either. We don't want to resist those things, because what we resist persists. And I sometimes resist my own resistance. So then I'm in like double resistance, and then I don't feel good. That's our emotional navigation system telling us that we're separated from our authentic alignment and that we're piloting that vehicle of consciousness, like we explained in an earlier episode, on a path that might not be actually what's going to make us feel fulfilled. And that's why a lot of men are having trouble bridging that gap between achievement and fulfillment. So yeah, I would invite that shame to be there, and learning to feel emotions is a skill. Learning to be vulnerable is a skill. It's like playing the piano or something. You might suck at it at first, but if you have a really good teacher and you practice, over time, you're going to get really great at it. And some people are going to have more natural skills in that area in EQ, and some are going to have less, and that's okay. Perfect.
Yeah.
It's normal. And other men feel that way. I want everybody to hear that. You're not alone. You're not the only one that feels this way. And like I said, men confess things to me multiple times a day, different men from, I don't know, I have clients in 6 or 7 countries, and they're all in this together. And one of the things that shame needs to exist is isolation. So we can take a little bit of the charge out of shame right away by saying, yeah, that's normal. You're not alone.
Yeah.
And it's not your fault. It's not your fault, but it is your problem.
Yeah. Anything you want
As
to
they
add
say.
as we close off?
No, I think that's a lot for one episode. I would like to remind our listeners that my assistant used to say I'm a little bit like taking a sip from a fire hose, which is valid. And sometimes this is a lot of information, and this is new, might be new, not for everybody. For some of you, this will be old stuff, and some of you, this will be brand new, and some of this will be, wherever you are is perfect. But I would just invite our listeners to consider that if this is new for you, it might be helpful to listen a couple of times, because all we're doing is trying to create new mind models or trying to shift mind models, and practicing these skills will get easier over time. And when we learn something, learning is nonlinear. So we kind of hear something, we get it on one level, but we can only get things based on whatever level we're at. And then we kind of level up, and then we get another layer of it. And then, over time, we're planting seeds, we're watering seeds, and they're going to grow when they're ready. So stay patient, trust the journey, and reach out if you want help on this journey from me or somebody else. Or if you just want a book recommendation, or you have any questions, please reach out to us. And we're here for you. And just remember, you're not alone, and you're not the only man who feels this way. And we're in this together. And I thank all of our listeners. Anybody listening to this is definitely an evolutionary leader, and helping at that forefront, helping us evolve out of the emotional dark ages and redefine what it means to be a man and what it means to be in a relationship. And I want to thank all of our listeners.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, both for listening and for doing the work that you're doing.
Yeah. Thank you.
We will see you next week.
See you next week. What are we going to talk about next week? So we tell people.
Triggers.
Triggers. So next week, make sure to tune in, and we're going to talk about getting triggered or activated, and how that can actually be the portal and gateway to healing, integration, understanding our parts, and authentic alignment, and a life that is fun and fulfilling.